started. Okay, so this is the Building Energy Performance Standard Task Force meeting for September 15th, 2020, starting at 2:30 p.m. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to our website. Greetings, everyone. My name is Sharon, and I will be your facilitator today, as always. Go ahead and get started with a quick tour of Blue Jeans for new folks that might be on the line. If I can ask everybody to make sure you are muted, or I'm going to mute you for you. Sorry. Okay, so in Blue Jeans, up at the top is where your controls are. The first button is for your video camera. Second button is how to mute yourself. The third button, the little monitor, is where you share your screen, and I should be the only one touching that today. The big red button is how to hang up and leave the meeting, so don't do that until the end of the meeting. If you click on any of the buttons on the right-hand side, the people button will get you the list of who's there. That also gives you a second place to mute yourself. The chat box is probably what you're going to have open most of the day. When you are chatting, make sure that everyone is highlighted in blue to make sure that you're chatting to everyone and not a single person. And if you want to check your settings real quick, these two options of fit your video to view and always show video and layout controls, if you check those two boxes, it actually makes your experience in Blue Jeans a whole lot better. There's also a new version of Blue Jeans out there, so it's version 2.23 that actually allows for a 5x5 grid of people. I know we don't use our video cameras quite so much in our meetings because we're always sharing slides, but if you wanted to get to that version, I would suggest maybe sometime in the next 2 weeks uninstalling your Blue Jeans, and then when you click on it to come into the meeting 2 weeks from now, it will download the most recent version. So if you have any issues with Blue Jeans, please message me behind the scenes if you have any issues, and I'll try to help depending on what's going on in the meeting at that time. So the meeting is being recorded, and we post the recordings on our website afterwards with all the notes and the slides. We usually have a big group of people. At this moment, we have 35. We'll probably be up to 40 by the end of the meeting, and with that many people in an online meeting, it's really difficult to sometimes manage everybody talking at once. And so this group is super good about doing this. Please make sure you're muted, or I'll have to pause during the meeting to actually mute you. What we ask is that the task force members can comment at any time, but if you are a non-task force member, please use the chat box to request to talk, or if we open it up to kind of anybody giving comments, you're allowed to do that. So for our non-task force members, please use the chat box at this time to register your name, organization, and email to formally sign in. And I'm going to turn it over to Andrew real quick to do our roll call for our task force members.
All right, thanks, Sharon. I'll just go down the list and standard procedures to say here, hi, or present. Katie Bergfeld.
Here.
Patty Boyd.
Here.
You. Jen Croft is on leave. Marshall Dewar-Balkin.
Here.
Wendell Felder. Asa Foss. Dave Good.
Present.
Max Greninger. I think he's going to be late. I'm wrong. Adrian Gross.
Here.
Rush Mahala.
Present.
Jessica Jones. Monica Landrinow.
Here.
Cliff Majerzik.
Here.
Todd Nedwick.
Here.
Matt Prasky.
Here.
Joe Riley.
Here.
And Jay Wilson. All right, we have a quorum, and any task force members who come in late, just please sign in the chat and we'll get you down.
Awesome, thank you. So the role of our task force is to advise DOEE on creation of an implementation plan for the Building Energy Performance Program. recommend amendments to proposed regulations issued by DOEE, recommend complementary programs or policies. If a topic needs in-depth discussion, anyone can suggest moving it to a subcommittee, and this is an open meeting. Everyone is allowed to participate. So what I want to do is take a little pause in my normal opening of these meetings and introduce Director Tommy Wells as a special guest today. We are celebrating our 20th meeting. So we couldn't decide if this was a meeting-versary or a day-versary or a 20th meeting anniversary. We couldn't decide what to call it. So we thought it might be a special occasion to have Tommy come on and talk.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for letting me know this is the 20th anniversary so I could join, or not 20th anniversary, 20th meeting, big difference. But that means that all of you have been doing a whole lot of work, and, you know, I'm not sure whether to celebrate 20 meetings or to say, golly, you know, it's already been 20 meetings. But I know you've got a lot of work ahead of you. I do want to especially thank Annika, Matt, and Marshall for your leadership with this group as co-chairs. I think that, again, this is one of the most dynamic things going on in any city in the country in really implementing building energy performance standards. I know that in many ways the rest of the nation of urban America is looking to what we're doing, and they're going to in particularly look at what's the results of what you're doing and what your recommendations are and how we implement. This task force is, you know, I'm very proud of what you're doing. I see that you won the Leadership Award for Excellence in Government Advocacy or Policy in Local Government from the National Capital Region of the United States Green Building Code Center in July. But let me again reiterate that New York passed their bill right after ours, but they exempted some areas that we're not exempting. They went ahead and put their fines in there, but we decided we wanted to talk with the stakeholders and those impacted a lot more with input and through this process and not just do it by fiat. But there's other jurisdictions and other cities in America that I've spoken with that are afraid to do this. And they'll either get at it incrementally or they're just watching to see how we do this. And I believe that we have the strength, the talent, the vision, and the values to do this, to do it well. And I'm not at all shy about being under the spotlight for the country of individuals that are trying to do this. I know also that in the event that there's a new president, that the Green Challenge that the Democratic candidate is proposing starts with rehabbing or retrofitting something like 1 million buildings, and also residential. But everybody recognizes you have to retrofit our existing buildings in order to get to where we want to go. It's not just a building code for new buildings. It's the buildings that currently exist. And you're laying the groundwork and hopefully the path of how we're going to get there. And so it's important in the nation, and also obviously as we look at the wildfires, the storms, all the things that are happening as predicted due to greenhouse gases, it's just having a debilitating effect. It's not just loss of lives, but it will economically determine the future of many of our urban areas for the world, but no less in America. So how we address this and do our part and lead other cities is the path forward. So thank you very much. I'll be here at your next 20th meeting. And again, thank you very much for putting your time into this and giving us guidance.
Thank you so much, Director Wells. Katie, did you want to add anything to that?
No, thank you so much, Director Wells. We've been really, I think we have a great group here, and we've been accomplishing a lot over the last 20 meetings. We've been meeting bi-weekly since December, which is that's a big commitment for folks that have, their regular jobs and lives. And your comment about the affordable housing sector, I think the reason that we've been able to be where we are with that is that we have such great partners in the affordable housing sector that have been willing to work with us and really get us on a path that's going to be good for the district, and as you said, sort of set a model for the rest of the country. So kudos to all the folks on our task force that work in the affordable housing sector or work with them, because I think that that's been a key to really getting to the point where we're at and building this program in a way that's going to be more equitable and achievable for that sector specifically.
Great.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, we will move on with next couple of things. So our overall schedule, we do have less than 4 months before the end of the year. We're going to continue focusing on prescriptive pathway for today's meeting, but I added one thing down at the bottom talking about policy gaps that are not inside the purview of DOEE, especially when it comes to equity and workforce. So we're going to examine, once we get some of the technical guidance items finished, then we'll kind of delve into some of the things that are outside of the realm of technical guidance between now and December. So our agenda for today, we are actually going to finish the discussion on phases in the process timeline that we didn't finish last time. We're going to talk about building typologies in the prescriptive pathways, and then start talking about the structure of our energy efficiency measures and how we're going to lay out the information. And then we'll talk about, after we get through these, we will talk about the next couple of meetings and what we have planned for those. So for today's schedule, depending on the conversation and how active the conversation is, if we don't make it to all of the slides in today's deck, we're going to do the exact same thing where we'll just pick it up on the next meeting. So don't worry if it feels like we're not going to rush this particular conversation, and we'll just pick up where we left off on September 29th if we don't get through everything today. So I'm going to highlight the first two slides as a little bit of a recap from last time. One of the things that we talked about and just barely started getting into the conversation was our timeline on what the prescriptive pathway looks like. So we have these different phases. The phases don't necessarily match up exactly with a particular year in the 5-year compliance cycle, especially since we have an adjustment for this first period where we have an additional year. So what we talked about last time was phase 1 and kind of dug into some of those particular areas around selecting a pathway, talking about project assessment and the preliminary plan. And we're going to dig into phases 2, 3, and 4 at the beginning of today's meeting. So phase 1, I think we feel like we have pretty good feedback on this slide right now. We can always come back to this at a future meeting if we need to, but it talks about doing the project assessment, selecting the initial project team, completing the energy audit assessment, a financial assessment, which we talked about a little bit at length, talking about reviewing the results of the energy audit, what kind of energy audits might be good to require, their equivalency with ASHRAE level 2, and so on and so forth. We have some really good feedback on that, including the 3-cycle preliminary plan possibly being too long. Maybe it's a 2-cycle preliminary plan. So we're not going to ask for any more comments on this particular slide. And if you're interested in what feedback we collected, if you're new to this topic and didn't attend 2 weeks ago, you can go to our BEPS webpage and actually look up the notes from September 1st to refresh your memory. So phase 2 is about the design charrette, developing an action plan and O&M plan, and then project design. So I don't have any really super specific questions for this particular slide, but wanted to see if anyone had feedback or concerns. One thing we're curious about is on O&M plans, what type of assessments you all have seen on the O&M side that might be good for us to use when we standardize this, or how do we standardize an operations and maintenance plan and turn it into something that people might be able to turn some documentation in. That's one question I have. I don't know if other folks in the DOE have other questions about the other sections on this slide. And if anyone has feedback, you're welcome to just put it in the chat or unmute and ask questions.
I think, this is Joe. I think good kind of like O&M plans that like some, high-performing building engineering teams are using are going to be through their electronic work order systems, right? Like their predictive and preventive maintenance tasks that are, kind of scheduled and like show up on their phones and stuff. So maybe my suggestion would be for documentation, instead of prescribing like a certain format, being open to the idea of like, oh no, if you can export it and show it to us this way, because I think it's gonna be stickier and have longer kind of people are going to use it more if it's in systems that people are actually using rather than existing on some like checklist kind of like
right.
that was created for this purpose then kind of disappears.
Do you have like standard operating procedures that are kind of like this overarching document to what's put in the work order systems, or do people like that's on the shelf and they never look at it anymore? It's all in the system.
We put it all in the system. So that so that it just comes to you, because every task we just go piece of equipment by piece of equipment, and we kind of like have our best practices and original equipment manufacturer recommendations, right? And so you kind of merge best practices with OEM guidelines, come up with like kind of like maintenance tasks for equipment, and that they're all frequency driven, annually or weekly or daily or, every morning or every week or whatever, so they all have like a frequency, and so they pop up and you have to complete it, right? So I think most companies operate like that, right, with their work order systems. And so for any kind of like O&M plan of work, it's got to kind of get integrated in their workflows.
Yeah, we were thinking maybe for like some of our under-resourced buildings or a higher percentage of the buildings that are in the low-performing property type groups. One of the reasons that they're low-performing is that they don't have an O&M plan, and we're trying to figure out whether or not having this part of the process of actually creating an O&M plan if you don't have one and giving them a template would help them perform better. And fill in the blanks of not having correct operations and maintenance. And so, maybe if they do have a plan, then they just might download something out of their system and kind of present it. Or if they don't have a plan, maybe they fill out this template and go through the process of that. What do you guys think of that?
That makes sense. Committing teams to the rigor of developing, complete, preventive and predictive maintenance plans for their equipment will go a long way to, driving their performance. If the people don't have, task lists and equipment lists, and maintenance activities tied to those things. I don't know how they're maintaining their buildings, and so it's those probably are pretty poor performers. So making them do that, seems like a pretty good task. I like it.
Yeah.
Right.
I just add here, I think that to the extent that I would agree that if poor performing buildings often may not have a sense of what equipment needs to be upgraded when or how they're going to do that. I think it's bigger than equipment too, though. It's also about operating schedules and procedures and processes for going back and rechecking that on a regular basis to make sure that someone didn't just say, oh, this system isn't working right, we'll just flip the hold switch, and then someone forgets about it. At the more extreme end of that, from a rigor standpoint, you have things like regular retro commissioning check-ins, which may be something that could be considered or recommended. I also think, to the extent that this is, I'll do some more thinking and talking to people about particular documents that could be used, but to the extent that like the exercise of developing it may in some ways be as useful for some buildings as the actual plan that's developed. I think that's important. And the final thing I'd say is I'm not sure where DCSU is. I'd sort of put Patty on the spot here about continuous commissioning, but I think to the extent we can get more buildings moving in that direction, I think would be really helpful.
Right.
Yeah, all good points, Marcus and Marshall. I'd also add that this kind of an action or an activity is very well set out in, say, ISO 50001 Ready or ISO 50001. Having plans and using them and having them documented is one of the big requirements of an ISO 50001 or, like a quality program, ISO 9000 or whatever. Continuous commissioning would fall under our pay for performance program, pre-COVID. We're still trying to figure out what to do with pay for performance now with COVID. But having plans and creating them is a very important thing. So using a tool like that might be something that could be considered.
Can I ask for a little clarification from the DOEE side? Is the intention that the O&M plan or the requirement here to complete an O&M plan is specific to the equipment and measures undertaken in the action plan, i.e. to demonstrate that you have plans to continue operating the things you're implementing in best practice? Or is it you need to complete a building-wide O&M plan to ensure that both existing and any new equipment is operating efficiently?
I think the intention is overarching O&M plan, not just for the new items.
Okay. So in that case, that seems like, as Marshall and Patty are indicating, that is a significant source of potential savings. I didn't know, is that already considered as sort of on the list of available points available for the prescriptive path? Because that is almost essentially an energy efficiency measure in and of itself.
Right. I don't know if it is or not, because we're still working on that list and still waiting for some results from the cost study benefit, but it possibly could be. I think we just have to figure out how we would assign points to it. So maybe we can write that down in our notes and kind of follow up on that particular item when we get into the measures in a few weeks. I think it's been hard for us to find a really good template for an O&M plan that we could use. Like we were looking at ASHRAE 100, Chapter 6. But then ASHRAE 100, Chapter 6, you also have to purchase. So we're trying to kind of figure out, didn't know if anybody had any thoughts on some other standards that we might be able to use. Yeah, silence has been kind of our answer too. We've been struggling with this one a little bit.
Yeah.
I have to say that.
This is Christian from DOE. The ASHRAE 100 Chapter 6 and the kind of complementary Annex D and L are not so much a template of the plan as much as they are as the key criteria of what needs to be included within the plan. You can kind of use your own format. I think that kind of gets back to what Joe was saying. It's like specific to that building. They give you a list of the things that you would want to see in that plan, but you can submit it to us how you have it if you've already developed that as kind of a starting point.
I'd also say this is an area where the fact that the performance path is the default may come into play again, because you may have buildings. Yeah, it would be great if standard savings could be ascribed to O&M plans, but often I think it is difficult to do because it's really a function of how badly is the building operating in the first place, and you may not have that data. But you may have buildings that it'd be great if you could do it. If not, you may have buildings that do an O&M plan and discover there's major cost-effective savings, and they might decide it's more cost-effective to switch to the performance path, and that should definitely be something that is supported and encouraged.
Good point. Anyone have any other input on the O&M plan side of things? What does everyone think about what we have outlined under the design charrette?
The one piece that remains as an open question for me is around the 3-cycle plan for compliance. Right. And so just wanting to understand that better and what's required there. Seems like there's quite a bit that is outside compliance over the subsequent cycles is quite outside the control of the building itself within the first cycle. So that seems like a tricky thing to develop in the next year or two, or in the first couple years of a compliance cycle.
Yeah.
Or ever, right? Right.
Yeah, or ever. So just kind of would want to understand better what's being asked of at that stage to make sure that's something anyone could feasibly produce at not a burdensome cost or effort.
That is something that's like kind of catching my eye as we're going through all these requirements. Is I'm trying to count how many different plans have to be submitted, and it's just like at some point the plans start contradicting themselves, and I think it's some, so we've got like the 3-cycle plan, the action plan, the O&M plan, the list of goals, that's just on this slide, right? So it's something I'm a little worried about is like requiring a lot of plans, maybe too many, instead of like one big plan that talks about a couple of things.
Yeah. On this 3-cycle thing, I think Matt raises a good point. A building thinks that the 20% reduction is going to get them to the standard or close to the standard. They don't, especially if it's getting them close, then they don't know exactly what the standard will be next time, and so developing a long-term plan may be more difficult. If a building has an Energy Star score of 10 and it's going to probably be out of compliance in future cycles, then thinking about that longer-term strategy is useful, particularly, but we might want to sort of keep it higher level. Like these are major pieces of equipment that it's not cost-effective for us to do today, or in this cycle, but that we're teeing up for the future is something to keep an eye on. I think that's important. And also the question of sort of when does a building owner know they're going to sell the building, and at which point, and if they know that in the process, at what point can they then request some sort of, how does that then affect the need to do that longer plan?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. We already started thinking about adjustments to the idea of that 3-cycle preliminary plan. Do we do a 2-cycle? I think it's really just, and it could be 1 or 2 paragraphs. Like I think we're not maybe showing exactly how detailed things would be or not detailed, depending on the particular question. Some of these things, as we move through the phases, have to be super detailed, and some don't. But I think the 3-cycle preliminary plan, I think, is just trying to get people to think about future periods, and standards set, and what are they doing to, if their Energy Star score is a 10, they've got to think bigger, and what are they doing to do that? And so that's what we were going for. But the feedback's all good. It's all awesome. We are taking into account as we're adjusting things. Any other thoughts on this slide before we move on to phase 3? I love the links happening in the chat box right now. Keep them coming. This is awesome. Thank you. Okay, so phase 3 is all about implementing the project, actually doing it, and then testing to make sure and commissioning to make sure that everything is running correctly at the end of the project. So we've got the final action plan, permit drawings, specifications, construction documents, peer review of design drawings and specifications, actually executing the action plan, doing inspections and other documentation, and then actually implementing the O&M plan after everything is done. I'm just I don't have any specific questions on this slide, so I'm gonna open it up for thoughts. So be thinking about anything that might happen during construction and implementation of the project. And DOEE folks, if you have other questions that I haven't asked, please ask them now.
What's inspections look like?
I'm sorry.
Joe, go ahead and ask, and then we'll get the other person.
Oh, I was just asking if what you had in mind with regard to inspections for these things.
Christian, Katie, or Andrew, I'll let you guys answer that one.
Yeah, this is Christian. So some of the energy efficiency measures probably will require permits and inspections. And so those will most likely be leaning on the already existing DCRA process, just to verify that they've gone through the correct process the city has to get those implemented and inspected and make sure they're done correctly. Other measures will not have any permits or inspections required, so other documentation might be required. It might be invoices, might be pictures of installed elements, or different, just depending on the EEM, there'll be different requirements there.
What about this O&M stuff, Christian? Do you have some thoughts about inspecting buildings, almost how we used to get those recycling inspections and stuff, you just kind of show up and you're like, hey, I want to make sure you're, I don't know, that you're operating the EMS per your submitted O&M plan, or I'm just curious to what level you see this going.
It's something that we still need to consider. We don't have a huge staff to send people out and inspect 800 buildings. And so I think it's going to have to be mainly relied on the submitted documentation and then just a back and forth on that. We may reserve the right to do some on-site inspections if we feel like there's a need, but that's not been decided yet. I think once they develop the plan, hopefully they're going to implement it because they need the savings for future compliance with BEPS. And so I think at some point we're just going to have to take people's best efforts towards that, because if they don't do that, then they're just kind of shooting themselves. Obviously, we want to hold people accountable, but actually being there to make sure they're actually doing the O&M plan is a very difficult thing to have oversight on.
Totally.
So,
no, I agree.
So any feedback on that's hugely appreciated.
This is Cliff. I think it's a good idea to reserve the right to do on-site inspections, even if you never do it, just so folks will not be too complacent.
Agreed. I think we're leaning that way.
Could you talk a little more about what's intended here by the peer review?
Christian, I'll let you take that one too.
Yeah, so again, this is not 100% fleshed out. We don't have all the details of every single one of these aspects completely fleshed out, which is, again, why we're looking for feedback from task force as well. But certainly some EEMs per the DC codes will actually require commissioning agents, and commissioning agents like peer review before permit to make sure all the correct set points and documentation is provided for a proper install of those devices. And so there definitely will be some requirements on some EEMs for peer review from the commissioning agent prior to the permit to make sure that it's correctly integrated into the systems. It has all the correct information to be able to test the installed elements. But other peer reviews could incorporate other professionals reviewing your work, but that becomes an onerous, costly, timely addition as well. So we have to be careful not to be too stringent on that.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Agreed. One thing I think will be helpful when you put these documents together and they're published, especially from people wanting to comment on them, would be clearly distinguishing where things are existing, where you're just sort of repeating what the existing requirements of the building code or other DC rules are, and where there's something new that's being added as part of this process. I think that will help people understand the degree to which things are, they may not react as badly if they realize, oh, this was actually already required.
Oh, like referencing like most of the actions in this item are kind of DCRA driven, not DOEE driven, and we would just kind of get a copy of that kind of thing? Okay. Just to make sure I understood.
That's exactly my point, is that a lot of this stuff is, so peer review in this case is referring to existing DCRA requirements, not a new peer review process that you are adding. And that distinction, I think, is going to be very important to draw when this goes out for the public to see it.
Very good point.
Applies across the board. But
yep. No, very good point.
The other thing I think that's important to think about is how long you're expecting this phase to take and when and the time frame. Again, thinking, as I've been concerned about for this entire process, about the labor market and the workforce capacity. If the expectation is that every single building that's doing the prescriptive path is doing their implementation and installation in the same time period, year 3, hypothetically, for example, or something, that's going to create a much greater burden on the labor force and create delays. So I think both allowing for flexibility there is going to be important.
A very good point. Any other thoughts on this slide? Okay. So we'll move on to phase 4, which is the last phase during the compliance cycle. And it's all about closing out the project, evaluating it to make sure that things are running, that you're getting the savings that you expected out of it. If you're not getting the savings out of it, is there an opportunity for corrective action? And then we want to, in this particular phase, create a feedback loop to inform refinement of our prescriptive path for future cycles. So one of the questions that we have is, what does a project evaluation look like that might be turned into DOEE? that might help create some of this feedback loop. Because this is not something standard in our workplace. We're going to have to create a template from scratch or something like that. What are some of the things that we should be asking for feedback on or evaluation of the project?
I'm interested to hear this question too, because this is something we debate quite a bit, because we'll get in conversations with groups who want to charge, they'll help you come up with these measures and they're going to charge you a fee based on how much the savings or whatever. But it's just these savings, the methodology for these savings calculations, even the ISO approved methodologies, there's a lot of fuzzy math that go in there, because there's things like occupancy and tenancy changes and weather that really make all this stuff tough to pinpoint to specific projects.
True. That's very true. I think some of this might be a lessons learned just for basic project management. What are some of the things that went wrong? What went well? How can we learn from the process? I think for this first cycle especially, even getting some feedback on how our DOEE process went and, how can we refine it and that kind of thing.
Simpler might be better here, your raw improvement, right? And then which measures did they do, right? And it's kind of at the end of a fantasy football season, it's always just out of all the champions, 70% had Christian McCaffrey and 20% had Devontae Parker, right? It's just kind of looking back and saying everybody that saw more than 20% improvement, they had Marshall as their consultant, or there might be some trends that come out when you just look at if you kind of keep this part of it simple, you might get better information if you try to make it too complicated.
Right. One of the things we were thinking about on opportunity for corrective action if necessary was if the only thing they get penalized, because they're still compliant if they just do the project. So the percentage realized is really more for feedback for us to be able to refine our prescriptive pathway. But if they don't hit the 20%, then they can't use prescriptive paths in the second cycle. We've already pretty much decided on that. So if they were at 17 or 18 and wanted to tweak some things in their building and maybe ask for a little bit more time to do that, to hit that 20% so that they could use prescriptive path again in the second cycle. We are considering that. What do you guys think of that type of action or process?
If it's not too complicated, that might be a good idea. You just have to be really careful that you create the right incentives.
I think it's a good idea, but I want to highlight. Sharon, you said we've already decided that if they don't hit it, they can't, and I think that is somewhat true. But there's also been the concept that's come up again and again that if there is a single measure or a few measures that were estimated at a given level of savings, and it just doesn't work out that way across the board, and there are systemic issues, and a lot of buildings don't hit their measures because they, if they did what DOE expected, then say penalizing them across the board, everyone who did that and then doesn't get it is a problem. So I think
agreed. Yeah, agreed.
That's important.
We would adjust for that. Yeah.
Right. So on that note, one thing we've said before that I want to just highlight quickly again is keeping this fairly simple, giving people the ability to do that corrective action, to document what they did. But I think there is a role, potentially as a separate and separately contracted thing, and to be very clear, this is not an area where I work, but to do measurement a more rigorous measurement and verification on a targeted, statistically randomized basis across the board, to figure out what measures are working and what aren't, using potentially sub-metering and so forth in some cases that isn't an obligation being put on the building owners and isn't being done for every building, but is being done across the board enough in a rigorous enough way to give that certainty that is needed to say, okay, these measures worked and these measures didn't.
So would the suggestion be that measures that building owners are installing and are doing sub-meters on their own, our request would be, would they share that specific information with us so that we can refine
Certainly,
prescriptive pathway?
yeah, certainly that would be very useful if people are doing that, but they may not be doing, if they're not doing that, they shouldn't be being made to do it. So yeah, if they have that data and can be shared already, that would be fine. And then in addition, potentially, there are a number of good M&V consultants out there who do M&V for utilities all over the country who could do a randomized sample to do further testing on certain things.
Yeah, but that would also cost money, and we have
I'm
no
aware of
idea
that.
whether or not we would have that funding. But I agree that it's an interesting concept to look at
So
and decide what we could do. Go ahead.
if you want that data, then I recommend offer that as a point towards your compliance, right? So it may not directly be an efficiency measure, but if of the, say you need 20 points to comply with the prescriptive path, 1 or 2 points can be achieved by agreeing to install system level submetering and sharing that data with DOEE for measurement and verification purposes. Then it provides an incentive for someone to spend the money to do it, potentially.
Think what Andrew could do with all that data. It'd be good.
And if you do that, I think you want to be really careful to have some real parameters around the format of the data and the quality of the data and things like that to make sure that you're getting useful, usable data. I know that some other programs have had problems with getting garbage data.
Great point.
Right. Well, and the point in the chat box about random samples, I totally appreciate that. And we would have to figure out what that means and whether or not, if we did want to do a random sample, or, you know, or at least making sure that it's random within a certain range of property types and not put it to where people wouldn't sign up for the program because they were installing sub-metering for those points or for other purposes. Yeah, it's hard to do the random sample, period, without funding where we could randomize our sample across particular property types and then go from there. Yeah, it's complicated without funding. That's a neat idea, though. Any other ideas on feedback loops, or go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, aside from that, this kind of phase doesn't actually feel like a whole lot of required or needed by the building or the property owner, right? Like, what much more can we provide than you have the list of measures that were implemented, and you're seeing if we don't have sub-meter data, then you already have the benchmark results or the benchmark data to see year-over-year results. So this feels like it's primarily on the DOE side to do the evaluation and analysis of, as Joe was saying, which buildings did which set of measures that generally were more successful in achieving results than others. But otherwise, it doesn't feel like there's a whole lot here or more that the complying building can do.
Yeah, I think that's kind of one of our questions is, do we still have a template with a certain amount of questions in them for them to evaluate the performance of their, project to create this feedback loop, or do we randomize a survey of all of the people that did the prescriptive path and make it a little bit more anonymous and not tied to a particular building? Or do we, what is that feedback loop? Or do we just make every single building that did a prescriptive path fill out a one-page questionnaire or something like that? That's what we're trying to figure out. Does anyone else from DOEE have questions for the group? Does anyone else on the call have other thoughts about this particular phase?
This is Christian from DOE. I'd have one question about the second bullet point here. So the post-implementation evaluation, if X% of savings is not realized, I know Sharon mentioned 20%, and we talked about before in the task force, if building does not realize a certain percentage of savings, they wouldn't be allowed to do the prescriptive pathway in the future. That's kind of a penalty of not doing the measures well. Of course, barring some unforeseen miscalculation on our side that we just gave too many points to a certain measure. And we found that out of the data. What percentage do you think is correct there? Do you think it's correct at 20%? Do you think we should give some leeway in there because of change of use and just fluctuations in energy use and make it like 18 or 17%? Or take it all the way down to 15%? Where should that threshold be? And I'd love to hear the feedback from the task force on that.
Yeah, if you want to put what your thoughts are in the chat box, that might be a good one to use the chat box for. What would be a good percentage for that threshold? Yeah, Joe, we're talking about all of them as a group. Like if the prescriptive path is supposed to equal the 20% performance savings, we know there's going to be some up and down, and they're going to have to choose multiple EEMs to be able to group together to hit that 20. But we have some flexibility in the technical guidance to say if you don't hit an 18% threshold, then you can't use the prescriptive path in the second cycle. So, or something like that, barring we estimated wrong on a particular item or something like that. Or we can say, no, it needs to be the full 20 or something like that. That's, I think, the question that we're asking. If you total things together.
So you're eligible to do prescriptive path for a future compliance cycle.
Yes.
That's the question. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, removing the things where we just estimated wrong. I think that's separate.
Sharon, and Joe, correct me if I may be misinterpreting what you said here, but are you also proposing that since each EEM will have a anticipated threshold, we would determine a overall threshold for your EEM package having to meet a certain savings level depending on which EEMs you pick, so like each one would be customized and there's not a strict number? Does that make sense what I just said?
One more time, Andrew.
So if each EEM has different anticipated savings and there's uncertainty around each one, is that what you're asking if we have? Maybe I'm misinterpreting. Never mind. Scratch my idea.
Well, it's almost like a plus minus 2% or something like that. Like 20 doesn't necessarily, we're giving minus 2 percentage points or whatever, and you have to hit the 18% to be able to use it again.
Right. I think what I was thinking is that plus or minus X percent could be variable based off of what your selected EEMs are. But I'm not certain we are going to have that granular data, so I don't want to raise that entirely.
Yeah, no.
Yes. So going at this question in a different direction, which was how do we not unfairly penalize someone to not be able to participate in the prescriptive path in the second round? It almost seems like we're we were going at that previously sort of under the assumption that someone weren't going through this in a good faith effort or somehow were taking advantage of the system, such that we now see the level of rigor required in the documentation for the prescriptive path. It's almost like if they didn't get the outcomes, but they went through all these steps, are they not necessarily going through a good faith and rigorous process? So it was almost like it seemed like that needed to be there as the stick if the prescriptive path process was low on documentation and rigor. Now that we're seeing it's high on documentation and rigor, I don't see the scenario where it makes sense. Someone checked all these additional boxes. They did an energy audit. They did an O&M plan. They did an action plan. They did a 3-year compliance cycle plan. They went through this. They got the inspections. And then it turns out they got a 14% reduction instead of the intended 20. That, like, it almost feels like the only reason they should be precluded from participating in the prescriptive path in a second cycle is if they didn't do those process things. They didn't complete an O&M plan or they didn't complete other things. Does that make sense?
I think
No,
Matt
that's
has
a very good way of rephrasing it. Go ahead.
I think Matt has a really good point here, as does Joe in the comments. The question here is now again with the level of rigor here, who is at fault here? If the issue is the building operations changed, well, then that doesn't preclude the prescriptive path. That's something else that's happening. I made a comment in the question about a potential way that might be able to be adjusted for, though I would defer to Andrew on whether or not that would work. And then if the issue is who's doing the install and the measures, again, is it the building owner's fault or is it the installers? Is it the design engineers? Should instead of saying someone can't do the prescriptive path, it's some sort of, if there were a couple companies that did the work for a lot of buildings that don't hit their target, maybe the fault is with that company, and that company shouldn't be able to, be used for the prescriptive path in a future cycle or something like that, instead of penalizing the owner.
This is Patty. Can I add a little scenario that I've seen before? So there's many energy efficiency technologies, and in hotels specifically, they have the in-room occupancy sensors. For example, Incom, who is a great vendor, they sell them all over the world. They're the elephant in the room for that type of technology. I've seen where, and I'm not going to, it wasn't even Incom, or it maybe what was, where they installed their system in hotel rooms. And I could see energy savings for the first month or so, but then because the HVAC systems in the room couldn't get to the comfortable temperature that the people, that are renting the rooms expected as quick as possible, they actually turned off that efficiency measure because their business is to keep people comfortable, right, in a room. So it wasn't necessarily the vendor's fault or the installer's fault. It was the fact that the existing equipment couldn't respond as quickly as possible for the case of a hotel room. So, they spent, I don't know, $50,000 to put this equipment in, and it didn't work. So there's scenarios where efficient equipment, nobody did anything wrong. It was just that it couldn't work in that scenario.
Right.
And then I'll add in interactive effects, right? So you're getting an estimated savings for megawatt hours or something, say, but it might end up being that your therms go down because your fan speed is gone. Like there's interactive effects between different types of savings that nobody can calculate in an estimate. They're going to estimate it, right? But you don't see it until everything has been implemented. So two different scenarios.
No, very true. And I think the way Matt restated it was very well said. So I think we can take this feedback kind of back to the office and kind of think about that particular item and how we would want to evaluate it. And it may be that we don't decide exactly how we evaluate it until that sixth year, because we need to see the results of the first cycle. It's so hard to decide some of these things ahead of time when we don't know how the first cycle is going to go. So this is all good feedback. Yeah. Any other thoughts on the phase 4 slide?
Well, this is Cliff. I think we've heard a lot of good points, and there is a lot of unpredictability, and we need to account for that. But I would recommend that GOEE keep in place not allow people to repeatedly use the prescriptive path and fall short. If you can have some sort of accountability for contractors, that's great. If you can't, and I think there's a possibility that it'll be hard for you to do that, then I think you're going to have to leave it on the owners and have the owners effectively hold their contractors accountable. But folks can design to save more than 20% so that they have a fudge factor, so that they have an error margin if savings fall short of what was intended. And we should keep in mind that the prescriptive path, I mean, it's not essential. If they can't use the prescriptive path, then they just have to use the performance path or the standard approach, or or they can go to file an alternative compliance plan, although we want that to be rare. St. Louis designed their BEPS after DC did, and they did not create a prescriptive path. They didn't think it was necessary at all. So, I think what we want to avoid is a situation where we're defining down success, and we're just not going to hit the climate savings that the city needs to hit.
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, this is Katie. I just want to echo what Cliff was saying, because I think that I hear all of you saying that there's going to be a lot of good faith efforts of people, making a good faith to follow the prescriptive path and to do what we're asking them to do, but we're also going to have a lot of bad faith efforts, and we really have to address that, and we have to ensure that the prescriptive path does not become a loophole. We don't want it to be a loophole where you're kind of skirting the actual performance requirements that are sort of the basis of this law. This law is meant to be a performance law, right? And so this is meant to get performance. And I hear what all of you are saying, but I think that there needs to be a level where DOE is sort of controlling, for lack of a better term, sort of controlling the conversation, that like it's fine if you went through a prescriptive pathway and it wasn't successful the first time around, but we're not going to allow you to do that again, and you can take the performance pathway and then you can show that 20% performance. And
so
if there is a systematic error or issue with the modeling, yes, we will address that, and we need to be able to collect this information so that we can address that, so we can address those issues. But I think that we really do need to make sure that we're making sure that we're addressing people who are making bad faith efforts and not doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I think that that's the issue, is that we're making a blanket statement without really knowing, like, A, if the modeling is accurate yet, B, if it is, to the point that was made earlier, certain contractors who aren't fulfilling their obligations, or other people kind of up and down the food chain or supply chain. And there's just a lot of things that aren't, this is the first cycle. I do think that in future cycles, there's definitely room to sort of crack down. But I think in the first cycle, you've put a lot of guardrails in this and a lot of structure to it. And if someone's like, I need the prescriptive path, I need the structure, I want to follow this. I think it's, I do agree that DOE should retain the ability to prevent people from using it if there is clear signs that there's abuse of it, that they're not doing it, they're not fulfilling how you've defined it. I mean, I think there's a lot of structure to this. There's a lot of requirements. If someone has signed up for this, and they're not fulfilling all of the requirements, then I think it's, absolutely kick them out. So you can't do this again. We didn't feel that you met the obligations of the prescriptive path. You're going to have to move into the performance path in the next cycle. I don't have any problem with that. If someone is doing all of the things in the prescriptive path, which is quite extensive, and they're at 17%, 18%, 19%, and we're not quite sure why. If it is a contractor, if it is a poor modeling, it's a weird anomaly. I just, I don't want to say that there's this blanket like you absolutely can't do it. I just want to, not in the first cycle. In future cycles, maybe that is the case. I just want to make sure we're leaving the door open for refinement from cycle 1 to cycle 2, and not just assuming that it's necessarily that the owner is not doing this correctly. we are trying to help people enter this in the first cycle.
Yep,
This is a
good
lot.
point. No, that's a good point. We'll take all of this. Has all been very helpful feedback, so we can talk out this issue. If anyone has any final thoughts on this particular one, please put it in the chat box, so we can make sure that it's marked in the notes. But I'm going to move on to the next topic, and then we'll follow up with refinement. So we're going to move on to new topics now. We are going to talk about prescriptive pathway building typologies. And there's a lot of information on this slide that needs a little bit of explanation first before we get too sucked down into the actual information. So one of the things that we have been considering at DOEE is prescriptive pathways and which building types will have a prescriptive pathway option. Because we are tying the information for the EEMs directly to the results of the cost-benefit study, and the cost-benefit study focused on the 4 main prescriptive pathway types that cover 80% of our building population, the initial thought was to only offer prescriptive paths for the 4 main types, the multifamily, office, hotel, and K-12 school. In our discussions, kind of behind the scenes, we have some people that love that idea and some people that don't love that idea, so we wanted to kind of bring it to the task force to have a little bit bigger of a conversation. Now, the left side of the screen shows the 4 types that we're working on at the moment. On the right-hand side, it's not all 80 building types. We have probably, I think, 55 building types represented in our benchmarking data. Some of them have 2 or 3 buildings, and some of them have 20 or 30. It's a big mix as to what they are. The building typologies on the left-hand side cover 80% of the total building population. If you take out public buildings, which would be like DC Housing Authority and DGS, it's about 84% of the private buildings are covered under the 4 main types. The rest of the property types, which I did just a sampling of the listing, this is certainly not all of them, but you could see down grouped at the bottom are a little bit of the ones that are more public focused, that maybe only DGS owns them, or DGS owns maybe the majority of that particular group. Kind of the initial proposal is that they do not have an option for a prescriptive pathway. We have some concerns about that, about, if we thought about the purpose of the prescriptive pathway is to offer under-resourced buildings or smaller buildings that don't know as much about the process, those guardrails or that process to be able to follow. It covers a lot of the people on the right-hand side. So by not offering a prescriptive pathway, that makes it a little bit of a wonky proposal. Could we generalize some information? I think I just want to kind of open the floor to comments, and then we'll see where the conversation goes.
What's the downside of opening prescriptive path to these other use types?
I think one of the concerns is for the individual EEMs, we are getting modeling from the cost-benefit study that we are going to use for the 4 on the left. So some EEMs, if you don't have the right type of building typology in there, you may not be able to generalize results well enough. So it could be that, we could see, like, if the prescriptive pathway on the left-hand side is 40 items, because we were able to model out 40 items in the cost-benefit study, there we go. If only 20 of those items were similar across the building types, then the prescriptive pathway on the right-hand side for these other building types might only be 20 items long, because we were only able to generalize a certain amount of the EEMs. Would that type of concept be okay?
I think that the concept of having fewer EEMs for buildings on the right is broadly okay. It's not ideal, but you don't want a situation where people, are are allowed to use EEMs that are likely to have very little impact on their building type, and so effectively the prescriptive path becomes a loophole that allows buildings to not save very much energy. So
Right.
I just think you need to err on the side of making sure that the prescriptive package is going to save a decent amount of energy for every building taking it, and that may mean that you're going to have to limit the options of certain building types.
Okay, other thoughts?
I don't know. My first impression was that just from a fairness standpoint, that my inclination was that the DOEE has to accept a little bit more uncertainty in order to offer this a sort of same set of compliance opportunity for all building types.
I think there's also potentially a middle ground of looking at which of, and this would be a generalization, but to what extent some of these building types are likely overrepresented and are more likely to be under-resourced. Worship facilities is the one that jumps out at me. Senior care might. Some of the others, social, meeting halls potentially. So forth. So I think there may be cases where it would be useful to have a prescriptive path. If it's less measures, it's fine. If in order to ensure that prescriptive path is going to work, you're going to just assume that each measure is going to be slightly less effective in these other building types than in the ones that model, that works. But I think wherever possible, a prescriptive, at least for the first cycle, a prescriptive path should attempt to be offered. But I do think that if the expert analysis and opinion is that there can't be there isn't enough data to do a prescriptive path for that building type, then that's what it is, and they'll make do, and the consultants industry will adjust and find, some consultants will probably target those for the performance path, and maybe that also then becomes a priority for future cycles, especially some types like worship facilities that are likely to be more represented. There's more of them that are smaller.
Right.
This is Cliff. I agree with that, and I would say also potentially you could say that one criteria that TCSCU or the Hub or others should use in deciding what buildings to help is to provide special attention to those buildings that can't take it, that have no prescriptive path that they can take advantage of. Because especially for buildings where there are relatively few in DC, it may not justify the work of creating a prescriptive path for them, but some extra hand-holding from TCSCU might go a long way.
Doesn't some of the planning, right, like the action plan, the processes that are required in the prescriptive path account for some of the some things are going to be mismatched, right? It'll be too many points to do this kind of improvement. But when they kind of go through that planning exercise, doesn't that get kind of like flagged? Couldn't it be something the DOE sees when they're reviewing these plans, just like, hey, this gets you all the points, but your projected savings are too low here. This plan actually doesn't work because you're supposed to be hitting at least 20%. So you've got enough points, but you're not getting enough savings. So you need to try again. Because I think the Matt's point about fairness makes sense. It just feels unfair. And then I think the existence of the prescriptive pathway in the first place makes a lot of sense, right? For investment, to keep the real estate market moving, to keep DC a place that people want to invest in. You want to be able to pencil some of these things with certainty, and medical office, senior care facilities, industrial space. These are all classes of real estate that people invest in, and you should be able to. It'd be nice to have the prescriptive path. I think it's good for the city if that's an option.
Right. Well, it is a good point. Somebody brought up that talking about square footage in smaller buildings, because this 20% of the building population is definitely going to increase as our square footage goes down. We're going to have more buildings in the right-hand side rather than the left-hand side as we get the buildings between 10 and 50,000 square feet in future cycles. So we may be able to remodel things or things like that to make their prescriptive pathways more robust as we get down to smaller buildings. Any other thoughts on this particular slide? I've loved the feedback so far. Okay, if you want to add anything else to the chat, feel free to. We'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on this one. We just wanted to kind of introduce some of the EEM categories that we're starting to think about in the different groupings. But we're going to refine this list based on the results of the cost-benefit study. So we didn't want to get too far down the rabbit hole of actually talking about this today, but we wanted to kind of put it out there as we start thinking about format and structure of what the information that we provide and some of the requirements that we're going to be listing for the individual EEMs. And that's where we're going to spend kind of the rest of our time today and probably a little bit on September 29th. So we wanted to kind of propose our format or our structure of exactly how we're going to list out the EEMs and kind of get a little bit of feedback. And then when we're in probably a couple of meetings going to be ready to actually talk about more information on the EEMs, this would give us a little bit more understanding of how we're structuring things. So in the listing of an individual EEM, we wanted to have an overview, prerequisites, performance requirements, any possible add-ons that might make sense for that particular EEM, documentation requirements, reference standards, resources that might point them in a particular direction, EEM sequencing that might be recommended, optimized pairing with other EEMs based on this particular one, and then we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about considerations and our commentary. So I'm going to go into each one of these in a little bit more depth and then give you an actual example of what this might look like based on an actual EEM that it's still example, but we'll kind of show you what it looks like. So I'm going to go through these next couple of slides that just kind of describe each one. And then I think I'm going to ask for feedback on the actual example so you kind of see what it looks like. And that might be a little bit more constructive use of the feedback time. So the overview of the EEM is a paragraph that actually describes the EEM's purpose and applicability. We are going to organize these by building typology and then by category, which were like the previous two slides, before you get into the actual EEM that would apply to that building typology and that category. So then we have prerequisites that are requirements to be eligible for this EEM. It might include existing conditions or indirect requirements. Performance requirements would be very specific requirements to that EEM, typically with several steps for compliance and the point structure based on expected savings. This is where we're going to be evaluating how many points this might be worth on the prescriptive path. We will be listing add-ons. So this is additional add-ons that might add additional points specific to the EEM. So like if you choose, let's say, a boiler and do it at this level, it'll be worth this many points. Or if you add this to it, it might be worth additional points to go from there. So then we'll be listing the documentation requirements, like what might be required, what would be required to be submitted to the DOE during certain phases, submittal requirements at design phase, or submittal requirements at the implementation phase. And we broke those down into approval of scorecard, permit, and its final approval. And those have to do with DCRA processes. And Christian, correct me if I'm telling any of this wrong. So for reference standards, we would be listing any codes or guidelines or standards referenced in the prerequisites or in the performance requirements. So if we have an ASHRAE standard or something like that, we would actually reference exactly which one we are referencing for this EEM. We would put in some links for relevant white papers, case studies, or other items that might help them understand this particular EEM a little bit better. Then we would have some recommended EEM sequencing. So if this is a particular EEM that really needs to be done second or third after another one, of how they should think about that. So we'll have some information in here about how they might think about that and pair it. That's what the optimized pairing is, what other EEMs might work or pair well based on cost savings or tenant disruption or interconnected systems, all kinds of different things that we're thinking about at this moment. I'm going to talk about considerations in just a little bit more. We wanted to kind of rank some different items to give building owners more information to be able to prioritize their decisions. And we'll go into that one in length during the example. And then provide a little bit additional commentary to give them more context or perspective on a particular item. So these are all examples. Don't focus on the actual information that is in the right-hand side of the boxes. These are just for us to kind of figure out what does this actually look like if we implemented it on a particular one. So we have not vetted any of the numbers or any of the exact information on the right-hand side of the boxes. So don't focus on that too much. But this just will give you an idea of what could be in that section. So this particular example is for multifamily in the HVAC category, and it's a central boiler replacement. So we would start out with a summary description that we haven't written yet on what the overview would look like for that EEM. And then we have a couple of prerequisites, number 1, 2, 3, or 4, of what needs to happen. Whether or not these are all prerequisites is up for discussion. But does this kind of idea make sense? Any feedback or thoughts about how to improve the prerequisite section or what to include in the prerequisite section? I know most folks are still reading the slide, so they kind of get an idea. If this makes sense and you don't have any comments, feel free to write that in the chat so that I know folks are in an okay place.
This is Katie Henderson. I'm kind of agreeing with some of the comments that are coming up. I'm not clear on prerequisite 2 and whether that's saying this is what has to exist in the building before the implementation or whether it's getting to what the requirements are for the new equipment.
I gotcha. Well, and I think we haven't quite worked out all of the details on our prerequisites, because I think as we're writing things, we're like, wait a minute, this isn't a prerequisite. This is actually a, a performance requirement or a requirement for install or something like that. I think we're kind of, that question that you just asked is going to make us think about this. So maybe we need to have, instead of calling some of them prerequisites, there needs to be an install requirement option.
I think that makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so prerequisites really are more existing conditions or things that need to have happened before you do your project, and then there's the actual requirements for the install versus, and that wouldn't necessarily be a performance requirement, which is on the next slide. So, okay. I have several people that agree. Thank you for speaking up. That's helpful. So we need to differentiate between prerequisite as existing conditions versus install requirements. Maybe let me go to the next slide. So this is performance requirements. And I'm not, as I'm looking at this, I don't know if performance requirements is maybe install requirements. Might be a better terminology. We'll have to kind of tweak that a little bit. Don't focus on the points on the right-hand side. We just threw some points in there. This is absolutely nothing to do with central boiler replacement and possible saving points. We just wanted to have points in there to be an example. And then we listed a couple of add-ons that could possibly be done at the same time that make sense for the particular EEM. Thank you, Marshall. Talking about the distinction between performance levels versus install requirements. Kind of, we'll refine our language in this particular section.
What's intended with add-ons?
Add-ons either might be an add-on that would have an additional point to it, that while you're doing your boiler, you need to install this, or actually add-ons might be, these two particular add-ons might be a little bit more appropriate for the EEM pairing section. So I think we're going to have to do some refinement between what's an add-on versus what is an optimized pairing.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I'll just have the install requirements, and then if there's something else that would help make it better, it's an optimized pairing with its own separate points. It either should get its own separate points if it improves performance, and if it doesn't improve performance but is best practice, then it should be part of the requirements.
Gotcha. Okay. So maybe we need to think about actually going to go to the next slide. No, I'm going to skip that one.
I agree with Marshall. The only thing I would say is that occasionally there may be add-on things that are so small that they should, if you're saying you only need 20 points, it may be a situation where you can't give a full point for it, in which case you may need to do it as an add-on or something.
Well, that's a good point. I actually skipped. I want to go back to documentation after a moment. Since we're talking about optimized pairing and add-ons, I think this page made more sense to review before I go back to documentation. You know, thinking about sequencing of order of different things, optimized pairing. Does this structure make sense, or any feedback? Maybe we already talked about it. Does it make more sense to put the optimized pairing and sequencing immediately after the install or performance requirements and add-ons? So in this particular thing, we have, this is the order that we have things in now. Before we get into like documentation and reference standards, does it make sense to move sequencing and optimized pairings up higher so we get them to think about things sooner?
Yes.
Yes.
This is Katie
Okay.
again. Are you considering, I think the optimized pairing is a great idea. Are you considering having any that are multiple measures but required to be done? If one is done, then the other must be done?
Possibly, but we would probably, if those are a must, we would put them in one EEM. We would probably already group them.
I guess in other words, so for example, air sealing, you might be able to do air sealing alone if you don't have a boiler per se. But if you have a boiler that you're replacing, you require air sealing. That's just an example, obviously.
Right. Yeah, I think we still have to figure that out. You know, and whether or not we consider things add-ons versus optimized pairings. I think there's, you know, the prescriptive pathway is very prescriptive, has lots of guardrails, lots of processes, but maybe the place where we could offer flexibility on what they choose to do is in the EEMs, you know, and whether or not we require it or not. Like, I think that's what we're still trying to figure out.
Sharon, can I briefly interject? Mm-hmm. So the intention of the add-ons was twofold. One was we're not going to have 500 EEMs for a building to select from. So some of the very small things you can do within a building that maybe produce like 1% are not going to be an option within your EEM selection. But maybe they make a lot of sense to go with this EEM and provide a small incremental additional savings. And that's where the add-on would be, as a potential add-on to that measure that's dealing with something directly related to what you're already doing, but was not big enough to have its own EEM. That's one example. The other example is where you make two things together and they're actually more than the sum of their parts in the energy efficiency world. So we're obviously going to have probably EEM for installing VFD pumps on your hot water hydronic system, because that usually is a sizable savings in a multifamily building. But if you do it with the boiler, a high efficiency boiler at the same time, you oftentimes will see higher savings than each of those separately would create. And that's where you might see something here that's both an add-on and a separate EEM. And that's all going to be directed by our cost-benefit analysis study of what that shows us.
Thank you for that clarification. That helps. I love the conversation going on in the chat box. We'll talk about refinement of our particular listing of our different categories and such. Let's move on to maybe documentation requirements. So Christian, you might, I don't know as much about this particular slide, if you want to help kind of set the stage.
So the idea, the prescriptive path, is they'll have to obviously be submitting documentation to us that they've actually achieved and done these EMs, and there's going to be very different, wide variety of EMs, right? So some will actually involve very substantial commissioning, and some will be a single system, and some will be throughout an entire building. And so it just really depends on the EM of what's going to be required at the different checkpoints.
And the steps on the left-hand side are DCRA steps, right? And we're talking more about phase 2, phase 3.
So the scorecard would not be a DCRA item, that would be a DOEE submission of your EEM selections.
Okay.
Like the final action plan, probably. But potentially a permit, but if you don't have a permit for your EM, which is possible depending on what the EM is, there might be nothing there.
Okay, so maybe at approval of action plan, and we just called it something different in this section. It says, this scorecard just confused me for a second, so, okay. Does anyone have any thoughts on this particular slide? We could definitely improve the language in this section talking about what's a DCRA process versus a DOEE process.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what the group thinks. I mean, my sense of this round of documentation you're showing on, in general, this specific to the documentation requirements, but also the measure specific description and all the additional detail, if folks agree. I mean, my impression is that these are the documents that are more geared for the energy efficiency provider community, more so than the building owner. That seems more like the stuff we were talking about earlier, the what happens in each phase. So I just keep that in mind. If that is the case, then that is instructive that, you know, the language here can be highly technical and detailed. And also, if that is the case, then I think at a later stage, as discussing what guidance documentation needs to be provided, it's like all this needs to be made clear from day one, such that when we hire or scope for an energy audit, that provider knows that we're going to be needing this follow-up documentation. We're going to be needing to do all of this additional, or we will be needing them to provide us with that as a deliverable. So keeping that in mind in terms of like a one-page document that says, I'm hiring someone to do an energy audit related to BEPS prescriptive path. What do I need to make sure they're doing?
So you put the right things in your scope of work. No?
Yeah.
Very, very good point.
That's a really good point, and actually might be a better place. I put a small comment in the side about the idea of sort of giving people some guidance on how long some of these different things take. But to the extent that this is the kind of detail that the service provider needs, the people who would ideally know how long these things take, the people who really need that information are the building owners when they're starting this whole process. So that probably actually would be sort of elevating those time estimates to that sort of high-level guidance would probably be useful.
Would it be helpful for either DOEE or the hub to provide an RFP template or an energy auditor or a designer for the prescriptive path? Like for that scope of work?
I think so. I think that's worth some more discussion, but a sample RFP or a template for RFP or scope of work, and also a sample audit report. Like, what is the deliverable going to need to look like? Because there are some to be appropriately aligned to BEPS, to set you up for success for the additional documentation and reporting requirements that may be different than what the end product looks like if you just called someone up and asked for an audit report today.
Gotcha.
This is Kate on Lindsay's behalf, clarifying question, especially for folks like Matt and Joe and maybe others. Would it be helpful to have an RFP template that was that specific? Like, are you going to go out and procure? Are you going to be that specific in procuring services to comply with the prescriptive pathway, or is it more helpful to have, the actual measures? So say you want to do a boiler replacement. Is it more helpful to have like examples around that. Just how are you thinking you would go about kind of actually procuring the work?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one I don't know that we're sort of thinking through now. Is it
Yeah.
something that is sort of tackled in a comprehensive and holistic way from day one? Or is it, we go through our normal process of implementing things, and along the way, we're making sure we're tracking along compliance, right? Either way, I think at minimum, the request is we don't want to be in the place where we've hired someone to do an audit, and then later we get to a stage of having to report something to DOEE, and then realizing, oh, wait, the
It was
auditor.
The wrong audit.
Or if, yes, but also that the auditor we needed them to have provided some documentation or deliverable in order to meet these documentation requirements. And then we have to go back, or we have to pay someone a second time, or repeat work, essentially.
Yeah, so the documentation requirements might be key so that you're ready to just kind of take it and turn it over to.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I would just kind of echo kind of what Matt said, and that we've seen groups kind of present like themselves as being able to kind of be your program administrator, right? Your program manager for just like BEPS compliance period, and they're gonna help organize the process, and so like, and then it's more traditional for us to just hire someone to execute a specific project, and we're the program administrator, so it's I don't know where we're going to land the different projects, how exactly we're going to contract it. So just having a specific list of what the documentation requirements are, making it as simple as possible so we don't screw that up. That would definitely be helpful.
Thanks.
Oh, good feedback. I see the notes in the chat. We'll definitely make sure that those items are in our notes. Does anyone have any other questions? Okay, if something else pops in your head on this particular one, go ahead and put it in the chat box, and we'll make sure we get it recorded. One of the other last items before we get into the consideration conversation is just some commentary, and I actually don't want to spend a whole lot of information here, but we might add some commentary information into the particular EEMs, but I think it all depends on what's being said in all of the other sections as to what commentary. It's almost more like notes or additional context, or just a little bit more information for them to be able to implement the particular thing. So I'm going to go ahead and move on this because I think we have maybe enough time to cover this last particular section. We'll see how the conversation goes. So one of the things we were thinking about doing in each EEM was to put in some consideration rankings where we would look at each one of these items in the particular EEM and give it a rank on a 1 to 10 scale. So it would give a building owner or energy service provider, whatever, whoever's looking at it, a little bit more information of if they wanted to install all things that had short effective BEPS ROI periods, and wanted to look for things that had a 10 or something over a 7, and then combined that with added asset value for their owner and make sure that they didn't pick anything below a 7 or something like that, that we would be able to at least point them, give them additional information to be able to point them in a particular direction. So this is, I don't want to do too much feedback on this particular slide, because what I'm going to do is show you the example, and the numbers on the next page don't focus too much on the numbers, and maybe why we did a particular ranking. We just filled in rankings to be able to then have this conversation. So the question for everybody on these particular slides are, do we have too many considerations? Do we have too few? Do we need to add some? Do we need to get rid of some? You know, is this a good idea? Is it not a good idea? Those kinds of things. So I'm going to put up this particular slide where we took the central boiler example for the multifamily building and then just gave them generalized rankings. So don't focus too much on the number. This is what the consideration section on the central boiler replacement would look like. Do you think this would be helpful for a building owner? What do you guys think of this idea? Katie, I saw some folks think it's maybe too many. What do you guys think of the idea of too many versus too few, or is it a right number? And you can put in the chat box if you want to. Joe, you think we should have 4 considerations?
I'm not sure if this isn't resonating with me. That's something I would use because it feels subjective and, you know, from a certain angle, or, you know, it's this concept isn't resonating with me.
Okay, that's good feedback, though. Thank you very much. That goes a little bit with Katie's comment.
Yeah, I was just gonna say a little more. I mean, we, you know, do audits for building owners, mostly multifamily, and I think, you know, there might be probably 2 or 3 that they would be willing to discuss with us, and beyond that, it seems like something that is just gonna be too much information in the section I'm envisioning it being put.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we also, as we were talking about this when we were setting up, we were thinking, would people confuse these numbers with the point value that they would be earning by doing this particular EEM? And we wanted to think about, if we kept this section, should we use something different than these numbers?
Like red light, yellow light, green light kind of thing?
Yeah, and not make them numbers, just so people didn't accidentally confuse them.
All right, just give things a green dot or a red dot.
Right? So if we were going to keep, let's say, the top 4 to do this, if folks want to enter in, I see some of this is already going down in the chat box. If we were going to keep the top 4, which top 4 would you keep? Yeah, I think folks definitely want some other scale other than the numbers. We can do that if we keep it. I know folks are probably typing, but let's do these top 4 items if we kept this.
I think short-term ROI would be one. People are gonna focus on, you know, things with quick ROI. Those,
Mm-hmm.
green lights there will be easy ones to pick.
Okay. What do y'all think of ease of implementation?
That
it feels
seems
pretty
very
subjective,
subjective.
like
Yeah,
ease of
I
implementation
know.
has everything to do with occupancy levels and like, your hours of operation
Right.
of your site. It just feels too unuseful because it's like, how do you know, like my building,
Right. Well, I think when I think of ease of implementation as a project manager, it's more of like, well, can I do it after hours without like changing out some light fixtures or something like that and not have to change out the whole ceiling? Or do I have to completely empty the area to be able to do it? Or, I think there's, does the building have to be shut down for a week because I'm changing out the boiler? Or I think it's maybe a combination of like disruption of the space. Do I have to close it down or not? Or is it something that I can do after hours and have not people move out of their space versus disruption to occupants or shutting down the building? I don't know. For me, that might be useful information as a project manager, but
That makes sense. Yeah, I'm sure you can generalize these things.
we could probably
that makes
group a few of these together. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are interesting ways to view the various measures, but I'm thinking about the process of how measures are going to come in front of the decision makers at each building, and it's in my mindset, it's less likely to be we're going to be looking at the whole landscape of potential measures and saying which ones of these should we investigate further, and rather it's going to be we've hired someone to conduct a study or an assessment or an audit of a building, and they're going to bring to us the half dozen or dozen measures that are cost effective for the building, right? Like the starting point is the energy efficiency provider doing the report to bring it to us and already filtering the potential suite of available measures, more so than us saying, oh, right? Rather than us filtering the list. Now, will some folks still need that assistance to better understand each of those measures, to say, hey, which of these are disruptive to my building occupants? And therefore, something like this is helpful for them to understand that? Yeah, that will certainly still be the case.
I'd agree with that. I think this feels like something more like from like the what science the hub. Like this is like a tool that the hub could develop to help people along, less something that DOE needs to feed them.
Oh, that's a good point. That's an interesting consideration because it's not part of the regulatory, requirements or something like that of the prescriptive path that maybe we stick to the requirements and decide exactly how do we deliver the additional, more informational parts of the EEM to the person. Is that kind of the way that feedback was going?
I just feel like this is I think the onus here is kind of on, I think, not DOE, right? Like the onus for these considerations is on the owner, and if people need help, that's why the Green Building Hub exists, right? But it's just like, I think you're making your life more complicated here by including this, and it's like the onus isn't on DOE with this aspect.
Okay.
That's just my humble opinion. I don't know.
Thank you, Joe. I really appreciate it.
I will say
that's why everybody's on the task force.
I've been putting a bunch in the comments, but I will chime in to say I think that in terms of something that you might be getting directly out of the cost-benefit study and be able to use here,
right.
The distinction between annual and lifetime savings is important, and I assume when you're thinking about the ranking of points, you're thinking about the impact for short-term, and so then somewhere else sort of quantifying or teasing out for people the potential long-term impact, or maybe it's the other way around. But that's if you can get if there's additional information about the sort of long-term temporal impacts that's different than that comes out of the cost-benefit study, that's different than what is going to be captured in how things are ranked, then that would be, I think, useful to include here.
Okay. Since we're getting short on time, that was all super awesome feedback. Thank you for listening to the boring part of the structure of the prescriptive pathway and helping us kind of refine some of these different sections. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this conversation, but if anybody has any other thoughts that you want to put in the chat box, please do so. And we'll just go ahead and wrap up the meeting for today. So on September 29th, we don't have to save any time to complete any of the prescriptive pathway discussion from today, but if we feel like we made some refinements and want to come back to everybody with the talking about our timeline process and then the structure of the EEM, we might save some time to be able to do that. We'll see how the next couple of weeks goes. We are going to spend some time on deep retrofit pathways for single buildings. We are in the process of setting up a campus subcommittee meeting for in between September 29th and the 13th, October 13th, to be able to talk about the campus deep retrofit pathway and what that might look like. So we're going to save the campus part of that conversation for October 13th. And we want to do a little bit more of a deeper dive on the affordable housing side. Michael gave a short update a couple of weeks ago or in August, and we want to kind of dig into it and actually look at their recommendation report and make sure that we are addressing things properly and get a little bit more task force feedback. And then on the 13th, we will talk about that campus deep retrofit pathway and then start digging into the energy efficiency measures based on when we get results from the cost benefit study and when we feel like we'll be able to start talking about those a little bit more in depth. So we think that's going to be October 13th. So that's the plan at the moment, and we'll just kind of see how things go in the next couple of weeks and go from there. So just a little bit of a reminder that our next monthly webinar is on September 24th. So if everybody can help do a little bit of social media on the hashtag same Eventbrite and the same hashtag. So if you have, everybody will help me promote this. We may be doing a deeper dive into the hub because they're getting close to launch, possibly in October. So we may do a little bit of a deep dive on that next week. So I'd love for everybody to help me with a little bit of social media to make sure people sign up. Are there any announcements? Katie Clift asked a question in the chat box saying, can DOE provide an update on when we expect to publish draft BEPS rules for public comment? You want to tackle that one?
Sure, yeah. Molly, are you on the line still?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, so it's with our office's general counsel. Molly's on the line, and I don't know, Molly, if you can give a quick thought on when we think that they're going to be out for a comment.
Sure. So we still have some, we have the DOE's draft is basically complete, and we still need to receive approval throughout the executive office of the mayor, so EOM branch. And then also we need to finish up review with the Office of Attorney General, who needs to provide a legal sufficiency on anything that we publish. So, you know, we're working as quickly as we can with these other offices, and hopefully we'll have something out within the next few weeks.
Awesome. Thank you for the update, Molly. As a little side note to that, some of this part of the process is a little bit out of our control, and it depends on schedules and such for other offices within the government. and several weeks, but we'll just have to kind of see how those processes go. Want to give that little disclaimer. We also have a draft of our task force report that I've sent off to a couple of folks that said they would be happy to help me edit. So if anybody is interested in being part of that process, send me an email and I can send you a link to the draft document if you'd like to edit that. We want to make sure that that particular document is released at the same time as the rules go for public comment. So if you'd like to be involved in that process, please let me know. Any other announcements?
I have a very nerdy data one that I'll try to keep short. But for those who are familiar, DC has been part of a Department of Energy accelerator initiative to generate unique building identifiers, which are geolocated, for lack of a better word, VIN numbers for actual built structures. This is kind of a universal identifier, which just wrapped up last week, and we are effectively the first city to publicly release our UBIDs for general data consumption. I'll drop a link in the chat in a second, but for any of those who are interested and want to geek out about building data identification, I'm happy to talk offline.
Awesome.
And major kudos to our Green Fellow, Addie, who was so instrumental in getting this done.
Yeah, Addie.
Yeah, that was a lot of work.
Yeah, and I also, on that note, we just surpassed a 95% compliance rate for the calendar year 2019 benchmarking data. So that's a really big milestone for us, especially considering the fact that we're in a pandemic. We still had, nearly perfect compliance this year for the benchmarking law. So things are going well on that side, and we're continuing with the data verification process in partnership with SEU and Bauman Consulting. And so we're getting through some verifications right now. So things are looking good on the benchmarking side of things as well.
That's great. 95%. Wow. Very cool. Any other announcements? Okay. If not, we will close down the meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.